Last month, I watched a documentary about the engineers who built the Golden Gate Bridge. The narrator described the obsessive, almost brutal standards. Every calculation checked and rechecked, every rivet inspected by men who knew a single flaw could doom thousands. It was a monument not just to steel, but to an unforgiving culture of competence. Then I read the official report on the Boeing door plug incident. The language was entirely different. It spoke of process gaps, communication breakdowns, and quality assurance oversights. The human element, the specific failure to meet a clear physical standard, was dissolved into a fog of bureaucratic passive voice. What struck me was the total absence of shame. In the old report, failure was a moral stain. In the new one, it's just a learning opportunity. We've swapped the hard, objective judgment of did it work for the soft, subjective question of did the process feel inclusive? And that's when a chilling thought hit me. We aren't just building worse bridges or planes. We are systematically unteaching ourselves how to tell the difference between a thing that stands and a thing that falls. We are, in real time, watching a civilization forget its own instructions.
Welcome to the deep dive. If that introduction felt intense, it's because the subject we are tackling today is, well, it's arguably one of the most critical structural shifts happening across complex societies. We're talking about the systematic erosion of competence.
It's an incredibly high-stakes topic. And what makes this whole thing so insidious is that it rarely happens with a loud crash. It's more like 1,000 quiet policy decisions.
Right. Decisions that slowly redefine what success even means, moving it away from objective reality.
And towards something more like subjective compliance. And the material we've gone through argues these decisions are now having a real demonstrable impact on critical systems, safety-dependent systems.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to really explore this concept of systematic de-skilling. We see it cropping up in engineering, medicine, higher education.
And we're going to approach it through three sort of interlocking arguments that we found. They help explain the mechanism, the engine behind it, and maybe even the cultural root of the shift.
So what's the first one?
First, we're going to investigate the highly contested claims around an empirical correlation, the link between the proliferation of DEI mandates in these critical sectors, engineering, aviation, healthcare, and a documented increase in systemic failures.
And the key there is going to be separating correlation from causation, right? Following the data exactly where it leads.
Precisely. The second step is to drill down into the engine that's, driving this change. The sources we've looked at point to the quantifiable growth of ideological bureaucracy in higher education.
They use a pretty colorful term for it.
They do. They call it the administrative tumor. And the argument is that this structure is actively shifting power away from academic rigor and, away from intellectual standards.
And the third piece connects all this back to culture.
Right. We're going to ground these structural failures in a cultural critique. We're using Christopher Lasch's diagnosis of the therapeutic state and the culture of narcissism to really understand the cultural precondition.
Why this is even allowed to happen.
Exactly. It helps explain why the inner emotional world of an individual can sometimes take priority over the external demands of, say, a critical mission.
So the stakes, as you can probably already tell, are enormous. Mm-hmm. This isn't just a debate about efficiency or, wasting tuition money. It's about operational safety. It's about reliability.
It's about civilizational resilience. When we talk about competence, what we're really talking about is the integrity of all those unseen protocols that keep a complex society from, frankly, descending into chaos.
And for you, the listener, you need to know whether the systems you rely on, from the electrical grid to the flight deck of a plane, are being maintained by people who prioritize reality over compliance. So let's start with what the sources identify as the root cause, this idea of the death of objective standards.
Right. And to be clear, we're talking about very specific benchmarks here, things like the LSAT for law school or load-bearing calculations for engineering or the rigorous medical licensing exams.
Guardrails, essentially.
The guardrails. And the core argument being presented is that these are increasingly being recast. They're not seen as neutral measures of ability anymore. They're framed as barriers. As racially or culturally or historically exclusionary.
Which is the fundamental intellectual premise underlying this whole shift.
It is. If a standard produces a demographic outcome that is seen as undesirable, the logic then goes that the standard itself must be biased. It must be unjust.
So the question changes.
The question changes entirely. The old external standard was, did you meet the standard? Simple. That gets replaced by subjective validation.
Questions like, do you feel included? Are your identities represented in the group?
Exactly.
Now, on the surface, that sounds like a I mean, a well-intentioned effort to increase representation. But what are the concrete consequences when you move away from that objective measure?
The consequence is what the argument calls institutionalized defensive narcissism.
Okay, that's a dense term. Let's unpack that.
It is. So the sources suggest that institutions, especially the big ones, are incredibly invested in their public image. They have to appear progressive, inclusive, equitable.
It's the institution's ego, in a way.
Precisely. But here's the challenge. Genuinely elevating the performance of underperforming groups to meet these really high existing standards is, well, it's hard, it's time-consuming, it's expensive.
It requires a deep investment in things like primary and secondary education, things universities often can't or won't do.
Right. So instead of raising the performance to meet the standard, the easier path is to just change the standard to meet the current level of performance.
That's the core mechanism of this defensive narcissism.
That's it. To protect the institutional image, the appearance of equity, you lower the standards for everyone. Or you replace them with subjective metrics that are, frankly, easily gamed. The goal shifts from fostering excellence to prioritizing the appearance of inclusion.
So this strategy shields the institution from criticism. That's the defensive part.
And it focuses entirely on its own image. That's the narcissistic part.
That reframing is really important. It suggests this isn't just about diversity for diversity's sake. It's about institutional survival. It's risk avoidance.
Avoiding bad press by getting rid of the metrics that would expose underperformance.
Yes. So what's the counter-argument to that? What was the original point of these standards?
The source assertion is that these traditional standards were never meant to be fair in a social justice sense. They were designed to be, and this is a great phrase, guardians of reality.
Guardians of reality.
They ensured competence in roles where it was absolutely critical. I mean, if a structural engineer fails to account for shear forces, the bridge collapses. It doesn't matter what their background is or how included they felt during their training.
And reality, as you said before, does not negotiate.
It does not. And the sources argue that dismantling these standards based on subjective social criteria is effectively disarming civilization. You're disarming it in the face of an unforgiving world of physics and material science.
And this kind of systematic, negligence leads directly to what the sources call the normalization of failure. You see it in the language. When a door plug blows out on a plane mid-flight or a bridge has a structural failure, the bureaucratic language immediately kicks in.
Process gaps, communication breakdowns.
Right. Why are these always framed as isolated accidents? Why aren't they seen as symptoms of a bigger systemic problem, a competence erosion?
Well, that passive language is part of that defensive mechanism we were just talking about. To admit that, say, the specific human failure to secure 4 bolts was a symptom of a systemic erosion of standards.
Where compliance replaced inspection?
Is to admit a huge moral and institutional failing. It's so much safer, bureaucratically, to just treat it as a one-off, an anomaly that needs a little procedural tweak.
So the sources claim that when the guiding principle for selection shifts from capability to inclusion and administrative compliance, society is engaging in a feudal war against physics itself. Why physics? Why is that the ultimate judge?
Because complex systems, aircraft, power grids, bridges, they are nonlinear, and they are all subject to entropy.
Meaning they naturally decay. They trend toward failure.
Always. And maintaining them against that trend requires constant, active input of objective competence, of precision, of skill. When you start replacing those inputs with subjective or therapeutic or ideological concerns, the system's resilience just degrades. The failure becomes a mathematical certainty. It's just a question of when and where it's going to show up.
This idea of the chain of competency breaking down it's really powerfully illustrated in an anecdote we have. It's about a structural engineering professor, a Dr. Sarah Jenkins. This really takes these abstract concepts and grounds them in a, frankly, horrifying reality.
Yeah, the story is profoundly illustrative of how an administrative regime can just override professional judgment. So, Dr. Jenkins had a student who repeatedly failed the final exam on load-bearing dynamics.
Not just once.
Not once, but 3 times. Now, in any rigorous engineering program, that student would, without question, be required to switch majors. It's a closed door. The ethical obligation of that professor is to prevent that person from ever being in a position to sign off on a design that could kill people.
So she had a professional and, you could argue, a moral duty to fail this student. But that's not what happened. She ended up in an administrative confrontation.
That's right. She was called into a meeting, and present at that meeting was an administrator from the Office of Student Equity. And immediately, the discussion just pivoted. It moved away from the technical failure, the student's inability to calculate material fatigue.
The actual, physics.
To actual physics. And it shifted to the student's feelings and the optics of student retention. The conversation started revolving around things like equitable grading modalities and the supposed trauma of standardized testing.
Not the non-negotiable standards of building a safe bridge.
Not at all.
So what was the administrator's leverage? What was the pressure point they used?
The pressure point was that failing the student was a barrier to his progress, and that this failure reflected poorly on the institution, not on the student.
And the student himself, how did he react?
Well, this is the really telling part. According to the report, he was completely unbothered. He was just checking his phone during this whole discussion about his professional future and, potential life or death consequences. He had clearly learned the lesson.
That the real test wasn't mastering the material.
It was administrative compliance. It was negotiation.
So the professor felt she had no choice. She was forced to change the F to a pass. And that moment, that specific decision, that is the breaking of the chain of competency.
That's the critical conclusion here. Dr. Jenkins realized in that moment that she wasn't functioning as a guardian of knowledge or public safety anymore. She was a compliance officer for an internal administrative policy. She broke that chain of knowledge transfer, and in doing so, sent an unprepared individual into a field where reality imposes immediate, catastrophic consequences.
This is the systemic outcome, prioritizing the process over the product.
It's the collapse of standards in favor of administrative compliance, and that's a terrifying thought.
That story really shows the internal conflict, right? The administrative battle when standards are challenged. But what happens when these internal conflicts meet the hard, unforgiving external world? For that, we really only have to look at an industry where failure is instantly catastrophic, aviation.
Absolutely. And the argument for prioritizing meritocracy in this specific safety-critical field is one of the most forceful points in all the source material we looked at.
Why does aviation occupy such a unique category?
Well, the consensus in the materials is that, unlike many other sectors, errors here lead to immediate, large-scale death. There's no margin for error. The entire system is built on layers and layers of redundancy, protocols, and just unforgiving standards. They're all designed to screen for and demand exceptional technical proficiency.
So the argument being presented is that aviation simply cannot afford to treat standards as negotiable social constructs.
It can't. And the source material argues pretty forcefully that DEI policies that involve quotas or preferential hiring practices, they introduce an unacceptable level of risk precisely because they can erode that meritocracy.
How so?
Well, if the hiring process starts to prioritize demographic representation over quantifiable skill and experience, a policy known as preferential hiring, the entire safety structure is compromised right from the very beginning.
And this risk isn't just about one individual pilot or mechanic. It affects the entire team.
That's the critical human factors element of it all. High-stakes environments like a cockpit or a maintenance hangar depend on absolute team cohesion, on radical trust.
A first officer has to trust, implicitly, that the captain earned that seat through superior skill, regardless of their background.
Exactly. And if the perception exists, or worse, if the reality is that individuals were selected based on criteria other than raw competence, that trust erodes. And that can cause a breakdown in something called crew resource management, or CRM.
Which are the standardized procedures for communication and stress management in the cockpit.
Right. They're the bedrock of modern aviation safety. If that trust isn't there, CRM can fall apart when it's needed most.
So according to the sources, what does the research on human factors consistently show are the most reliable predictors of performance in these high-stress roles?
The focus has to remain on objective traits. Things like experience, continuous training, cognitive ability under immense pressure, and a fanatical adherence to stringent protocols. These are things you optimize through objective standards, through simulator time, through relentless reality testing. They're quantifiable, and they exist entirely outside the sphere of demographic characteristics.
Now, we have to address the intense polarization this subject creates, especially recently. Following some aviation incidents, particularly the tragic Potomac crash that's referenced in the material, political figures immediately inserted themselves into the discussion.
Oh, yes, immediately. You had high-profile political figures, even leaders of one major union, claiming that the focus on diversity was a disaster.
And that it resulted in people not being competent enough to do the job?
They explicitly made that link. They argued that safety failures were being caused by a focus on making the industry less white, and that qualified applicants were being turned away because of their background. Now, it's important to note, this claim was highly charged and based largely on anecdotal fears, not really on data.
And that's where we have to step in and be the objective guides to the material. We have to present the empirical counter-evidence. We have to look at the actual data correlation between safety and diversity over the last 2 decades.
It's essential. You have to juxtapose those political claims against the historical safety record. Let's look at the period from 2004 to 2024. During this exact period, the industry was consciously working to increase representation, so diversity grew significantly.
Do we have specific numbers on that?
We do. For instance, the percentage of women working as airline mechanics almost doubled. It went from 3.4% to 6.9%. Black pilots and flight engineers saw a jump from 1.7% to 4.4%. And Hispanic and Asian representation also saw really marked increases across the board.
Okay, so we have a clear, measurable increase in diversity across the workforce during that 20-year span. Now, let's look at the fatality statistics for the exact same period.
The reduction in fatalities it's just dramatic. And it runs completely counter to the political rhetoric that was claiming systemic failure because of diversity. So in the 12 years right after 9/11, nearly 400 people died in U.S. commercial airline crashes.
400?
But if you look at the entire decade between 2014 and 2024, so just before the specific crash that was mentioned, only 2 people lost their lives in commercial airline incidents in the U.S. too.
That is a staggering reduction in risk. And it coincides precisely with that period of increasing workforce diversity.
It does coincide. And this brings us to the crucial analytical nuance that the sources really hammer home.
Which is?
While the increase in diversity coincides with this extraordinary decrease in fatalities, there is no evidence of a cause and effect relationship between safety and the demographic composition of the cockpit or the hangar.
So the industry didn't get safer because it was more diverse?
Correct, just as the crashes did not happen because of diversity.
So what did cause the massive safety improvement?
The sources attribute it primarily to unrelenting objective advancements. Things like mandatory standardization of training-specific simulator requirements, for example, technological improvements in aircraft automation, stricter maintenance schedules, and the global adoption of those highly refined crew resource management protocols we talked about.
All objective systems that demand and test competence relentlessly.
Yes. And this really highlights the core dilemma in this whole debate. Safety was achieved through the unwavering application of meritocratic principles and objective standards. The data shows the industry became significantly safer because it got more rigorous, not less.
So the conclusion here is that aviation's improvement is really a testament to the success of objective competence.
It is. Precision, standardized training, experience, those remain the ultimate priority. The workforce composition might be changing, but the governing principle for selection and performance has to remain strictly meritocratic to ensure survival. When objective rigor is paramount, the system tends to be able to absorb demographic changes without compromising safety.
So if the erosion of competence is the result of shifting standards, we need to find the institutional structure that's actually generating and enforcing these new subjective standards. And according to the sources, that engine is bureaucratic bloat, specifically within higher education.
And it's described in some pretty alarming terms. A quiet coup by an administrative tumor.
What exactly is this administrative tumor?
It's defined as the exponential growth of non-faculty staff. So compliance officers, Title IX coordinators, HR personnel, DEI bureaucracies, this whole class of employee who collectively consume resources and exert power far beyond their original mandate. And in doing so, they shift the focus of the entire institution.
And the data that quantifies this growth is what makes that term tumor feel, well, appropriate. Let's look at the staffing statistics.
Yeah.
We have data tracking non-faculty positions across 4 decades, from 1976 to 2018.
Yeah, this data provides a really clear picture of just how disproportionate this expansion has been. So over that period, full-time student enrollment increased by 78%.
Okay.
And full-time faculty increased by 92%. So roughly in line with student growth.
Seems reasonable. But the administrative classes?
They dwarfed both. Full-time administrators increased by 164%. But the most shocking category, the one that really jumps out, is other professionals. That group surged by a staggering 452%.
452%. Who are these other professionals? Are we talking about necessary IT staff? Or are we talking about people who manage social life and compliance?
It's a mix, but the sources break this down. And they note that while some of that growth is related to genuine modern needs, like IT security or research compliance, a very significant portion is dedicated to student services and compliance mechanisms that exist purely to manage or enforce ideology and feelings.
And this shift is reflected in where the money is going, too.
Absolutely. If you look at the period between 2010 and 2018, non-instructional spending, which includes administration and those student services, grew much faster than instructional spending.
What are the numbers there?
Student services spending grew by 29%. Administrative costs grew 19%. Meanwhile, the core instructional spending for teaching and research only went up by 17%. The spending priorities clearly show a pivot away from the academic mission.
And a big driver of that student services growth is the expansion of diversity, equity, and inclusion staff. How quantifiable is that specific area of bloat?
One analysis found that the average university now employs more than 45 individuals dedicated exclusively to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
45 people. That's not just a small office. That's a massive, highly resourced arm of the institution.
It is, and to put that staggering figure in context, the sources make a pretty chilling comparison. The average university has more people devoted to DEI than it has professors teaching history.
Wow.
And it gets worse. The DEI staff is more than 4 times larger than the staff that provides legally mandated accommodations for students with documented physical or mental disabilities.
So what does that tell you about resource allocation?
It implies a massive allocation of resources toward ideological compliance and managing subjective experience, over and above core academic functions or even legally required accessibility.
So this huge resource drain leads us to the core consequence, which is the corruption of the university's actual mission. The sources argue that mission is shifting away from free academic inquiry and developing capable adults.
The new mission, according to this critique, is centered on 2 things. First, providing therapeutic coddling, and second, enforcing ideological orthodoxy. The traditional goal of the university, to challenge students intellectually and prepare them for an independent adult life, is being subverted.
Let's dig into that idea of infantilization. How does expanding student services actively prevent students from becoming independent adults?
The contention is that these expanded services, staff organizing every aspect of their social life, running mandatory sensitivity trainings, providing comfort through trauma resources every time there's a challenging headline.
It removes the friction.
It removes the natural friction that is required for adult development. If the university acts as a constant babysitter, an emotional therapist, and a social life organizer, it denies students the necessity of self-reliance, of risk management, and the crucial experience of learning to manage difficult emotions on their own.
It creates individuals who, when they face the real stresses of a workplace or a crisis, they look for an institutional solution. They look for an administrator to fix their feelings, rather than finding internal strength.
That is the key psychological takeaway. And at the same time, this administrative bureaucracy is expanding its enforcement arm. This means mandatory trainings, complex reporting mechanisms, and processes designed, as the sources claim, to enforce a narrow ideological perspective. And that, by definition, restricts the open, often messy, intellectual inquiry that's necessary for truth-seeking.
So this systemic shift of power away from the faculty, people who are actually dedicated to teaching and academic freedom, toward this administrative class is a fundamental threat to intellectual rigor.
It is a critical institutional change. The power moves from those who uphold objective standards, the faculty, to what the sources starkly call babysitters, therapists, and political commissars. And the consequence of all this is massive tuition increases, resources being diverted from research and teaching, and no corresponding improvement in academic outcomes or graduation rates.
Now, you mentioned that this bloat isn't entirely an internal creation. External pressures contribute heavily.
Oh, heavily. External pressures from, say, federal and state regulations or specific demands from accreditation bodies like the American Bar Association for Law Schools, they force compliance spending. One study of 13 colleges found that regulatory compliance alone accounted for up to 11% of their non-hospital operating expenses.
But the institutions also create their own internal red tape, often just to justify the existence of the administrative body.
Yes, the administrative body often justifies its own growth by inventing new processes for everyone else. A law professor cited in the sources noted examples like faculty being unable to simply issue a grade of incomplete without a formal, complex legal agreement.
Signed by everyone.
Signed by the professor, the student, and then submitted to an enrollment office. Another common example is faculty syllabi becoming these massive documents weighed down by pages and pages of excessive institutional policy disclosures that nobody actually reads.
And the time spent navigating that bureaucracy is time not spent teaching, mentoring, or researching. It's a huge opportunity cost.
And if we look at the extremes, the numbers get even more shocking. MIT, one of the world's foremost technical schools, had almost 9 times more non-faculty than faculty. Johns Hopkins, and this is excluding its vast hospital staff, had 7.5 times more non-faculty than faculty.
And there's one statistic that's just the most striking of all.
Yeah. 3 schools, Caltech, Duke, and UC San Diego, have more non-faculty employees than they have students enrolled.
More staff than students.
That structural reality completely redefines the core function of the university. It is no longer an institution primarily dedicated to the rigorous intellectual exchange between a master and a student. It has become a massive, complex managerial apparatus, and it often prioritizes its own internal operational structure and ideological output over the demanding objective standards of academic truth-seeking. This is the engine of erosion. It consumes resources and diverts institutional attention away from competence.
Okay, so we've established the structural failures. We've got the administrative bloat, the decline of objective standards. Now we need to identify the cultural soil that allows these structures to even grow, which takes us back to Christopher Lasch's seminal 1979 critique, The Culture of Narcissism.
Lasch's diagnosis is so vital because it moves beyond the contemporary idea of narcissism as just, simple egoism or vanity. He was analyzing a specific pathological personality type that he believed was normalized in post-World War II American culture.
A personality characterized by a profound but often hidden insecurity.
Exactly. So how does pathological narcissism, as Lasch defined it, differ from just everyday self-centeredness?
Well, the pathological narcissist is fixated on their external image. They're deeply reliant on others for validation. And they possess an incredibly fragile ego that just cannot withstand critique or failure. This deep insecurity is then masked by a performance of self-importance.
And Lasch argued that the social shifts of the 20th century, especially the rise of mass media and consumer culture, nurtured this personality type. It made it a kind of heightened version of normality.
And Lasch was particularly critical of how the proliferation of therapeutic practices contributed to this phenomenon, the rise of what he called the therapeutic state.
He was. The therapeutic state, as he defined it, is a culture where professional psychological models and therapeutic language start to permeate every aspect of life education, politics, the workplace, everything. And the focus shifted fundamentally.
From what to what?
The old system was focused on building character.
Meaning resilience, strength.
The moral capacity to overcome adversity and delay gratification. Yes. The new system prioritizes one's own feelings and cultivates personality, the external image, the persona you project.
Now, obviously, seeking help is a necessary and healthy thing. But when that psychological framework becomes the default mode for navigating all of reality, what's the cost to the individual?
The sources argue it creates a fundamental reliance on external validation, a lack of internal strength. They call it a therapeutic illusion. By outsourcing character development, that is, the process of learning to deal with discomfort and critique, to professional therapists or administrative compliance structures, individuals become less equipped to face reality's difficulties.
This reliance makes them highly vulnerable and fragile.
Yes.
And this cultural shift, where the internal emotional world takes precedence over external reality, has profound implications when you apply it to high-stakes crisis management scenarios.
It culminates in a concept the sources call the triumph of the self over the mission. And there's this alarming anecdote they use to illustrate it. It's set in a crisis management center in London during a devastating cyber outage that has knocked out critical parts of the power grid. It's an emergency. It requires total objective focus.
Lives are on the line. And the team lead is demanding immediate action from a junior analyst who is the only person who can apply a critical coding patch to reroute power.
The pressure mounts. The team lead regently presses the analyst for the status of the patch. And the analyst's response is a complete rejection of the external catastrophe. The analyst says, quote, "The tone you're using is triggering a stress response. I need to step away to regulate my nervous system."
And the analyst just walks out of the crisis center.
Walks out. Now, this anecdote is used not necessarily as a statement of common reality today, but as a chilling, dramatic projection of the logical conclusion of the therapeutic state.
Right. In that scenario, the internal emotional world of the individual becomes the ultimate priority. It overrides the external catastrophe entirely.
The code remains unwritten. The mission fails. The system collapses. All because the self took precedence over the needs of the system.
That story is a really powerful illustration of how this cultural preoccupation with the self can undermine the capacity for social solidarity. The mission, the shared objective reality, is just lost when the individual's internal experience is elevated above the collective need.
And Lash warned about this. He warned that this fragility, coupled with the need for constant validation, turns politics and the public sphere into a spectacle. It becomes driven by emotional manipulation and image rather than reasoned debate about objective facts. The narcissistic impulse is fostered by an administrative and consumer culture that guarantees comfort and avoids challenging anyone's identity or feelings.
So let's tie this all together. This narcissistic culture and the administrative bloat, let's connect it back to the systematic descaling we started with. This combination creates a devastating descaling cycle.
It creates a massive cognitive cost. And this is the crux of the practical failure. Every hour that an engineer, a doctor, or a professor spends filling out mandatory compliance forms or attending ideological training or navigating bureaucratic red tape,
The output of the administrative tumor.
is an hour not spent on essential objective functions. It's not spent on maintenance, on safety checks, on teaching rigorous material, or on skill development.
The institution literally forgets its primary function. It dedicates its resources to moral and ideological signaling rather than maintaining the complex systems it's responsible for.
And this leads to what might be the most profound and irreversible danger highlighted in the material: the breaking of intergenerational knowledge transfer.
What does that mean?
The old guard technicians, the engineers, the skilled professionals who maintain our complex infrastructure, electrical grids, water systems, aging aircraft, they're retiring.
And who is replacing them?
The sources argue that their replacements are people who have been educated in a culture that prizes lived experience and compliance metrics over the empirical, technical, unforgiving skill that's required to maintain a complex system. If that senior engineer cannot transfer their decades of objective, reality-tested knowledge to a generation that has been systematically taught to distrust objective standards, well, the knowledge chain breaks.
That is literally a civilization forgetting its own instructions,
Yeah.
which is what that opening quote warned us about. The complex systems we rely on, everything from satellites to water treatment plants, they're highly interdependent and, crucially, intolerant of error.
And since physics, complex systems, and entropy don't care about our administrative goals or the subjective feelings of the workforce, reality pushes back. The final assertions that these systemic failures, the plane incidents, the collapsing infrastructure, the power grid failures, they aren't unforeseen accidents. They are the direct, logical, and inevitable outcomes of prioritizing subjective ideology over objective competence.
The system is conducting a relentless reality test.
And the argument is that we are failing that test because we stopped teaching the skills required to pass it.
So to synthesize this whole journey, we've tracked a systemic shift. A shift from objective standards, which are guardians of reality, to subjective validation, which prioritizes appearance and feelings.
And we've identified the explosion of an administrative bureaucracy that enforces this compliance culture. It drains resources and corrupts the core mission of creating and passing on knowledge.
And finally, we have rooted both of these trends in a culture of therapeutic narcissism that elevates the fragile self above the demands of the mission.
The core conclusion that comes out of the sources is that meritocracy isn't merely a philosophical preference to be debated or negotiated away. It is, quite simply, a survival strategy for complex technological societies.
And to abandon it.
To abandon it is described as choosing a slow, comfortable, self-imposed descent into systemic incompetence, a descent that will be punctuated by unavoidable and catastrophic failures.
So for those who recognize this danger, for those who still believe in the necessity of the plumbing and the wiring, the analysis does offer a path forward, the construction of parallel structures.
Yes, the proposal is to build shadow institutions, professional networks, training programs, whether they're within existing organizations or entirely outside of them, places where competence remains sacred.
Where performance is reality tested relentlessly.
And where objective standards are upheld, irrespective of external administrative or cultural pressures.
Because ultimately, the harsh, unforgiving nature of reality means that physics and entropy do not negotiate. They operate on objective terms.
Civilization is not a default or a natural state. It is a continuous, active, and demanding struggle against entropy. And when the focus shifts from the hard, objective requirements of maintaining that civilization to the soft, internal, subjective world of the self, the system will eventually and silently collapse under the weight of its own complexity.
The only currency that counts in the face of reality is competence. Everything else, as the source materials conclude, is just noise on the path to oblivion.